about the next essay you're going to do. And I understand that this is very difficult. What I saw reading these papers, there's a wide variety of experience that students have writing papers. I think some people in this class have a lot of experience writing papers like this, and I think there are people that have a medium amount of experience, and I think there are people that have small amounts of experience. And it's not a complaint, it's not a negative judgment about you as a human being, but it means that you're going to practice. I think it's going to be, I think I'd like it done. So I want to talk about that a little bit. The biggest real issues, the next set of issues were, in your papers, don't use the word I or me. Don't say, I think blah, 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 blah. Just so you know, if you want to take notes on anything you've got, keep these papers back. If you want to take notes, it's great. Don't say I or me in your paper. If you believe it's true, say the B-52 was the best nuclear bomber ever built in the entire history of the world. Don't say, I think the B-52 was. Don't say, this paper is about the B-52 is. So don't say this paper. Don't refer to this paper or this essay. Look, I'm not trying to complain, but sooner or later I have to do this again in this class. How many people are still in high school? Remain seated. Okay. How many people think you're probably going to have to write a paper in high school sometime after today? Remain seated. Yeah, okay. So the stuff I'm telling you here applies not just to the next, because we're going to do 2 more essays in this class, and we're going to do 1 essay in the pilot ground school. So I want everybody to do, however many you missed, I'd like that to be reduced by half at least for the next one, at least. Okay, so don't say I or I think, or this paper is here to tell you how wonderful Mr. Johnson. Somebody said that one. Okay. The next part is the hardest part. Those people that didn't do it, this is probably one of the hardest things about the paper, and that is trying to formulate that introduction paragraph and the conclusion paragraph. And I think I'm sure I didn't explain it as well as I wanted, so I'm going to spend about 5 minutes explaining it. So if you were going to, here, I'm going to put it on the screen because I think it'd be better if I had some pictures. So we're not talking golden age here. So we're not talking golden age here. We're talking about the intro paragraph. You need to have a theme of the paper. And you need to have, and that is generally that first or second paragraph. Sentence. First and second sentence. It doesn't have to be 2 sentences, okay? It could be just 1. Like I'm going to use the B-52. If this was my paper, my very first sentence would have been, the Boeing B-52 was the most significant nuclear bomber ever built. And you see how this is my idea. This was a significant, or most important, or most awesome. I think somebody used the word cool. Okay, then the very next 3 or 4 or 5 sentences that are still in that paragraph need to be just the basics of why is it so significant, why is it so important, why is it so cool. So you have the theme of the sentence, and that is effectively most important. And then you're going to have 3 to 5 sentences of why it is so important. So I could have said something like this. The B-52 could carry more nuclear bombs than any other nuclear bomber in the United States. And the B-52 was in service on nuclear alert in the Cold War for 47 years. And the B-52 was the first nuclear bomber that was built in large numbers that could fly halfway around the world and strike any nuclear target the United States wanted. And to prove that this was such a fantastic and significant bomber, it is still in service in the United States Air Force today. So I'm going to say those 4 or 5 sentences are going to support that original statement. The theme is what is the paper's about a B-52, but why are you picking the B-52? And I'm not trying to harass whoever said the word, but you need to be more specific than cool. I would have preferred if you had used something like, and I don't remember what it was, I'll use a B-52. The B-52 is the coolest airplane ever built. Okay, cool is too vague. Bad word, but it's not. It's too vague. Even when I say the B-52 was the most significant bomber, even the word significant, I would be looking for another word than that. But you still have to come up with that first sentence or two, and I would try to just aim for one sentence. Effectively, you have to write a sentence. That first sentence is convincing somebody why you think they want to read the rest of the paper. Why should you read a paper about the B-52? Because it was the most significant nuclear bomber ever built. And then the next 3, 4, 5 sentences you have to say, just very basically, why was it such a significant nuclear bomber? Everybody did a pretty good job of each of the rest of the paragraphs, each talking about one of those reasons in the first paragraph. And each one of those paragraphs only has to be 2, 3, 4 sentences long. So here's the next thing you need to know. Those supporting paragraphs in the body. So now we're looking at the body. So we're doing 5 paragraphs. Each one of those is you're going to describe the importance of that item. So here's the deal. If I say that one of these paragraphs is that it's been in service, that it's been sat nuclear alert for 45 years, I have to say, why is that so important? Now, I know a lot about a B-52, so I could write a lot of pages about a B-52, and maybe I could pick a better one. Does anybody know what nuclear alert is? Nuclear alert is when you sit there, the airplane sits there full of fuel, full of nuclear bombs, and the crew is really, really close, like only a minute or 2 away. And if there's nuclear war, the crew runs to the airplane, starts up the engine, takes off, and goes and flies away and drops bombs and missiles on the bad guys. I'm oversimplifying it. But nuclear alert is on an Air Force base where the airplanes are sitting there ready to take off and fly halfway around the world and nuke the godforsaken commies. Or the godless commies. I always get they were taken by God or they had no God. But that's another story. Ask me after class if you want to talk about communism and religion. So if I was to say, if one of the things I said in the original paragraph, it was really significant bomber, and one of the reasons it was significant is because it was on nuclear alert for 45 years, then one of those paragraphs would say, the B-52 was on nuclear alert for 45 years. And then I would want to add 2, 3 sentences, why is being on nuclear alert so significant? So effectively, each one of these paragraphs here is going to be kind of like the first one, is that you're going to have this one statement in the body. You're going to have the one statement of what was important, and then you're going to describe why that is so important. And almost the conclusion is almost a repeat of the introductory paragraph. I'm not saying it has to be the exact words. In fact, I prefer it's not the same words. But if I put in my first paragraph that the B-52 was the most significant nuclear bomber ever built, I need to say something in the last paragraph and I don't have to use the word significant, although I could say the B-52 had more impact as a nuclear bomber across the world than any other nuclear bomber. So it was significant, it had more impact. It's kind of saying the same thing. Am I helping anybody out here? How many people have turned in less than 10 papers like this before today? Less than 20? Less than 30? Okay, all right. Thanks. All right. So I have to tell you a very short story, and then we'll get started on history, because I know you're just dying to history. My mother was a high school English teacher. So when I went to my freshman year in high school, I had honors English. But back in the 1950s, when I went to high school, honors English, you didn't get AP, you didn't get college credit, and you didn't get extra grade points. Because when my daughter went to school, she was class of '02, so she's 33 right now. But in the class of '02 at her high school, if you took AP English, you got an A. You didn't get 4 points towards your GPA, you got 5. So you can actually graduate from high school with higher than a 4.0, which she did. You could get college. And well, when I went to high school, there was no extra points and there was no college credit. But my mother was a high school English teacher. So I said, Mom, look, it's going to impact my grade point average. How about if I take regular English, I'll try really hard, I'll get an A, and that'll give me 4 grade points. That'll keep my GPA up. But if I take honors English, I might get a B. And she said, you can do the work. And she made me take honors English. And I busted my butt, and I got a B. I deserved a B. No complaints. So then my sophomore year, I had to take another year of English composition. Mom, see what happened? If I take regular English, I'll get an A. But if I take honors again, I'll probably get another B. And she said, you can do the work. And she made me take English my second year. And I busted my tail, and I got a B. Deservedly so. I earned a B. I did the best I could. So then, when I was going to high school, you had to have 3 years of English. So most students, that third year, you either took English literature or American literature. It's going to be lovely because all you were going to do was read books and stories and then write papers. And I'm being facetious when I say that that was lovely because I didn't want to write papers. Fortunately, my sophomore honors English instructor, the next year, was going to be my third year in high school. The next year, she was going to run the school paper. She asked me if I wanted to be on the school paper. They needed somebody to write headlines and to handle all the bills for the advertisements in the school paper. And she said it counted for English credit. And I'm like, what? I don't have to take English literature or American literature and write papers for an entire year? You betcha, I'm in. So we put out like 9 editions across the 9 months. And so 9 times for that across that school year, I would write about 20 headlines that were not correct grammar, did not have punctuation, because they're headlines. And I sent out the bills. So instead of spending 9 months writing papers, I spent like an hour 9 times across the semester writing grammatically incorrect headlines. And I got an A. So the story's not over. So I graduate from high school. I go off to the University of California, Riverside, down in L.A., and they make me take the English placement test for getting into college. And I flunked it. They said, oh, you have to take remedial English, which back in those days they called it bonehead English. And it was so low that if you took that college class, you didn't get college credit for it. Usually college credit classes start at the 100 level, and it was like a 92. It was English 92 instead of English 101. So at the time, fortunately for me, so I thought all the bonehead English classes were full. Yay, I didn't have to take it, so I took history instead. At the end of the semester, I changed majors and I moved back to Reedley. And in January of that, in the middle of the school year, I started airplane mechanics school right where you're sitting. And I took a class here and I took a class there. Several years later, I'm active duty in the U.S. military, and I found out you can take these multiple choice tests called CLEP tests, C-L-E-P, college level entrance placement. I can't remember what they stood for. If you got a high enough score, a college could give you college credit for it. I took the English test. I scored high enough, I got credit for 2 college classes, English 101 and English 102. So I got my bachelor's degree in college, and my master's degree in college, and I never took an English class in college. So English was always the topic I disliked the most. All right, so if you want on your notes, we got 17 minutes, so we're going to go. The golden age is where we are. 06. If you want to write part 1, you can do that, because this will probably take us more than a day. You could also write, maybe in parentheses somewhere, the golden age of aviation is the decade before World War II. But I don't want you to confuse that with the previous topic where I called it the decade before World War I. If you'd rather call it the 1930s, that would be okay. But we're going to cover a little bit of things that happened in the late 1920s. So that might be a better way to call it. This would be the 1930s. And effectively, the golden age of aviation is because a bunch of awesome things happened and there wasn't a war during that 1930s. During most of the 1930s. Well, unless you lived in China, and then you were really, really unhappy in the 1930s, but that's a story we'll get into later. Charles Lindbergh is arguably is one of, if not the most famous pilot ever. I mean, you could argue that Armstrong is more famous, but he's famous for being an astronaut. He's not famous for being a pilot. Charles Lindbergh, he was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. I'll get to that in another slide. He learned to fly in 1922, and he ended up in Army flight school in 1925. And I was busy grading papers, so I forgot to look up and find out how come he didn't stay in the Army. I can't remember. So not only did he get his pilot certificate, he ended up going to Army flight school. So he was a well-trained pilot. He flew airmail, and we're going to talk about airmail before this chapter is over. But airmail started in the United States. It was dangerous. You flew when the weather was lousy. You flew with no weather forecasting. There were no navigation radios. There weren't very many airports. Usually landed in a dirt field or a grass field. They pumped gasoline out of 55-gallon drums. And he's famous because he was the first person to fly nonstop and fly solo. He went by himself. All those other Atlantic flights that we talked about with the R-34 dirigible by the Royal Air Force and the, was it the Vickers Vimy? There was 2 guys in it. And there was some other airplane that flew across the North Atlantic. This is the first time anybody did it by themselves. This is the part that's so awesome. He wasn't the first person to fly across the Atlantic. He wasn't the first person to do it nonstop. He was just the first person to do it by himself. So he had mucho machismo. Would that be an accurate statement? Okay, one person is nodding their head up and down, so I'll take that as a yes. All right. The Spirit of St. Louis is the name of the airplane. They named the airplane. Literally, businessmen in St. Louis came up with the money. And then they painted Spirit of St. Louis on the side. He did it in May of 1927. And it was a big deal. It was a very, very big deal. He was literally a national hero in the United States. We're talking the ticker tape parade in New York City. He was on the headlines of every newspaper in the country. He was the most famous person alive, probably in the world, certainly in the United States. It would be the equivalent, who would be the equivalent? There's not really any good equivalents. Somebody that everybody knows, but he's a good guy, not a bad guy. I can't think of a good modern equivalent. Oh well. Maybe Neil Armstrong, if it was 1969. Maybe that's a good equivalent. Question? Captain Sullenberger, yeah, he's pretty famous. But this guy was 3 times that famous. Because I think you could talk to people and say, who was Sully or who was Captain Sullenberger? And there's people in the United States who would go, I don't know. But in 1927, nobody would have said, hey, who's Charles Lindbergh? Nobody would have said, I don't know. They'd have said, Lucky Lindy. That was the nickname. He went on goodwill tours, man. not just in the United States, but in Mexico, Central America, and South America. You know why? Because he started working for an airline to open up routes in Mexico, Central America, Southern America. And I can't remember if it was either Pan Am or TWA. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Darn it. He also ended up working for that airline, flying the routes first to make sure there was a good way to go. Anybody ever been to Mexico? Yeah, anybody? I've been to Mexico. Anybody ever been to Central America? I've been to Belize and Guatemala. Anybody ever been to South America? My wife's been to South America. She went to Peru, went to Machu Picchu. She did the ayahuasca. Yeah, I know. She was like literally on a boat with paddles going up a tributary of the Amazon into the middle of the jungle. The bathroom was, well, there's a hole we dug about 20 yards over there. Yeah, the ayahuasca, it's a religious ceremony where you ingest a hallucinogenic combination of plant. You drink it, and it's like the worst thing you ever tasted in your entire life, and everyone pukes about 10 or 20 minutes later. Yeah, it's. She was looking for spiritual and physical healing, is why she did it. Yeah, but I don't remember how much it was. The biggest expense was the airfare. Yeah, she went with a group of about 10 people. She knew somebody that knew the guy that set up the trip. So it's not like she went online and kept her fingers crossed. But she was like way out. They went to a village. Well, not a crazy village, but it wasn't like there wasn't a building there. The only structures were handmade huts, if you will. Yeah. Enlightened. She was enlightened. How was she? Yeah. Yeah. Ask me after class. Okay. So here's a picture of Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, the Spirit of St. Louis. This engine cowling you can see that's got Spirit of St. Louis. If you open it up, all the people that helped build the airplane signed to the inside of it. I got another pretty good fun picture here. I like this one. This one's really fun. If you look, so let's see if I can draw here just a little bit. Whoops. This right here was a ginormous fuel tank, 425 gallons. 425 gallons. And look, he couldn't see out. Literally, there was a window on each side, and there was a periscope he could stick up and look out the top of the airplane. I'm not making this up. How did he fly remotely safe? I think he wasn't safe. I think he was fortunate in many, many ways that the weather wasn't that bad. You know, now, yeah, 1927. Okay, so this is 24 years after the Wright brothers first flew. 200 horsepower engine. Yeah, that's less horsepower than that six-seater outside, that white and red Cessna 210 that we've looked at several times. It doesn't have the propeller on it. That one has 285 horsepower. This airplane had 200 horsepower, and it weighed about 2,000 pounds more than that airplane out there. 1,000 pounds more, at least. So this guy had guts. Just raw guts. Yeah, I don't think I would do that. Of course, now it's stuck. Okay. All right. So next we're going to talk, so we talked about the Atlantic. We'll talk about flying across the Pacific. Now remember, you don't have to write this down, but you may recall in an earlier year, the Graf Zeppelin dirigible did an around-the-world flight. It took about 21 days. About half of that was in the air. And on one of its last legs, it went around the world from the west towards the east, so it went across. It started in Lakehurst, New Jersey in the United States and went across the North Atlantic. As it came around the world, it landed in Tokyo. And when it left Tokyo, it flew all the way to California non-stop. It didn't even stop in Hawaii. But that was with the wind. This stuff right here is talking about airplanes. It doesn't say the word airplanes on there. I wish I had put the word airplane. The first nonstop airplane flight from California to Hawaii was in 1927, so it was a few months after Lindbergh. 15 airplanes, 15 organizations entered the race. Out of 15, only 8 of them got off the ground. This is how reliable airplanes were in 1927. Now, it's not because the average airplane would only fly half the time. It's because these were, airplanes bigger than pretty much anything else and had very complicated fuel systems and were trying to get off the ground when they were very heavy. So 8 took off. 5 of them crashed. 1 turned around, and only 2 of them made it to Hawaii. How many people would get on an airliner if 2 out of 15 scheduled flights actually made it? And 5 out of 15 crashed. I don't know that of course, these aren't airliners. So I got a picture of a couple of the airplanes. So there's an airplane. They're not wearing their hats. They got their hats off, so I think that's interesting. And they got bow ties on. So there, just put a couple of guys in there and a lot of gasoline. Woohoo! All right, hey, and there's the. Now, granted, this was not the first around-the-world flight attempt. Remember, the U.S. Army did it. They took off with 4 NC-4s. 2 of the 4 of them actually made it. It took them how many days? Do you remember in those airplanes? 175 days. It took those. They left with 4 airplanes, and they had people staged around the planet with mechanics and engines and gasoline, and 2 out of the 4 made it. So here's Graf Zeppelin. So this occurred later. But out of 21 days, 12 of it was in the air. So that's awesome. So the 29 is way better than 175. And the airplanes that the Army flew, no passengers. No passengers. I was looking it up. You don't have to write this down. But each leg, they carried between 5 and 10 passengers. Most of the passengers were newspaper reporters, and a few of them were military personnel. Did it in 5 flights. They actually kept going. They took off from New Jersey, flew all the way to Germany, got gas, probably drained the toilets. I don't know what they did for sewage. Maybe they just, I don't know what they did. In any case, flew from Germany all the way to Japan. Germany. If you have trouble landing in the ocean, a Zeppelin is not that much fun, I'm going to guess. So they had some pretty good gets here, not as much as Lindbergh. And then Los Angeles to New Jersey, and I don't have it on here, so that hit their world around the world trip. But then they kept going and went to Germany, because people in Germany did Germany. So they kept going. So you could argue there was 2 around the world flights, but I don't like to look at it that way. So you don't have to write it down, but there was about 30 crew members, and they took 5 or 10 passengers. That would be fun, I think. How'd you like to crawl up between the gas bags to the top of the Zeppelin so you could get to the top? I don't think I'd get out and walk around, but... So there's a picture, and I can't remember which city this is over. Oh, they got them funny hats. Does anybody recognize this city? Yeah, me neither. Did you recognize it? I don't know what kind of headdress they wore in Japan, but my first guess is this is not Japan, and this is not Tokyo in 1929, but I don't really know what Tokyo in 1929 looked like. So. All right, here's one of my favorite airplanes of this age. Winnie Mae is the name of an airplane. It's the name of an airplane. No, this is a completely different, this is a new slide. Sorry. Oh, well, sorry, this is a different around-the-world flight. This is an around-the-world flight by an airplane with one guy flying it. Actually, the first time he did it, he took a navigator. So there was this airplane. It was called the Winnie Mae. It was a really awesome airplane. The fuselage was made out of wood and it was glued together, and it was very smooth on the outside. It didn't have a lot of aerodynamic drag. It was reasonably lightweight, and it was well designed. And it was made by Lockheed. You don't have to write that down. Wiley Post is the name of the gentleman who was flying it. Wiley Post lost his left eye in a factory accident as a child. His entire flying career, he wore an eye patch over his left eye and did not have depth perception. He made a joke one time and said, if they change the height of the telephone poles at the airports, I won't be able to know how low to go to land the airplane. Because he didn't have depth. Try driving around with... Don't try driving around with one hand over your eye. I actually, it's a long story, but I wore an eye patch for about 5 years and didn't have depth perception, and it is rather interesting. So he was the pilot. Harold Gaddy was the navigator, and they flew around the world in 8 days and 15 hours in 1931. So this was way better than that 175 days, several years before that. And one airplane took off, and the same airplane got back. So it was way better than the Army with 4 airplanes that took 2. And 8 days is way faster than the 21 day. What was it? 21 days that the Graf Zeppelin took? Was it 21 or 22? 31. Okay. And don't write anything else down. I'm just going to leave you with a picture. We'll get the rest of it. There's the Winnie Mae. Is there a better picture? I guess not. All right. I'll see y'all tomorrow.